put a break there.
Okay, all right. Workshop tonight. This, I believe this is our third workshop that we've held in GFD this semester on the topic of diversity and inclusion. So we're very happy to have you here tonight. Yeah, Cecilia, could you go to the interpretation slide, please? Okay, during this workshop, we will be using simultaneous interpretation. And so you have the option in Zoom to choose what language you would like. So depending on your language of choice, you can just follow the image as shown in the screen. So we have English and Japanese for this talk tonight. All right, and so before I introduce our speaker, I'll just say a few words about the University of Tokyo's Global Faculty Development Initiative. So we are at the College of Arts and Sciences, and our aim is to promote teaching excellence among the instructors who offer courses in non-Japanese languages. And so our overarching goals include: one, trying to expose current and future faculty to effective learner-centered teaching techniques. Two, to nurture instructors who can teach content courses in languages other than Japanese. And then to actively engage in exchange of ideas and research on global faculty development. If you'd like to find out more information, please feel free to check out our website. You can follow that QR code, which is on the screen. I think Cecilia will probably also paste a link in the chat window, the chat box at some time. We will be hosting another event on the 16th, or sorry, I'm advertising for another UTokyo faculty development event, which will be a symposium held on the 16th of December. And this is there's another faculty development group headquartered at the Hongo campus. And so they're going to talk about their future faculty development program. So information is on the slide now, although it might be a little small. I think Cecilia will probably be able to post a link into the chat window later. Okay. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and briefly introduce our speaker for tonight. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Mark Bookman, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College. His research looks at the history of disability policy and the connected social movements in Japanese and global contexts. And so Mark has been in and out of Japan since 2008. He's been supported by numerous grants and awards, such as a Fulbright Fellowship, Japan Foundation for Doctoral Research Fellowship. He's also involved with trying to develop policy as a disability policy consultant. And he's been able to collaborate with governments and corporate entities in Japan, US, Canada, and also with the International Paralympic Committee and the United Nations. So our format tonight will be, Mark will start with a talk about 45 minutes, which will be followed by a short Q&A. Then we'll take a 5-minute break, and that will be followed by sort of a workshop style discussion. Okay, so with that,
Thank you so much, Jim, for the kind introduction. And thank you everyone for coming today. Just give me one moment here while I share my slides. Okay. All right. Is this coming through? Are we able to see?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. So today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the role of universities in creating more inclusive societies. In the process of this talk, you'll be hearing more about me, so I'll skip my sort of generic self-introduction for now. But I want to start us off with some recent data that I find interesting, and I suspect you might as well. According to a recent survey, roughly by JASA, excuse me, currently 1% of enrolled students at colleges and universities in Japan are disabled. Within that 1%, there are many different groups of people with many different types of disabilities who are represented in different ways. So for instance, people with learning disabilities may be represented more or less than people with different types of physical disabilities. So the number of disabled people or disabled students in Japan at 1% of the total population is relatively small. And within that 1%, there's complexity. There are different groups of people who are more or less represented. And indeed, the reasons for that are myriad, and what I hope to discuss today. Thinking about this survey as just a starting point, there are a number of questions that came to mind as soon as I saw it. And I'm going to share some of those questions with you today as a starting point for our discussion of inclusivity inside and outside of Japanese universities. So the first question that came to mind when I saw this survey was, well, why is the percentage of disabled students in Japan so low at 1%? This is quite different from the overall population of disabled people in the country, which we know is at least 10%. Those are people who have identified or been registered with the National Disabilities Welfare System. And certainly there are many people who do not register. So the number is probably greater than that. So why is the number so low is the first question we have to ask. And then thinking about that diversity of representation, the fact that people with certain types of developmental disabilities may be more or less represented than people with physical disabilities, there's a question to ask about, well, inside of disabled communities, whose needs get prioritized and whose needs get excluded, and why? Why is it that our current system supports students with some type of disabilities and not others? And what might a reimagined system look like? And on that last note, there's a question to ask about what Japanese universities could do to reimagine their system to be more inclusive, to create a more equitable system where people with different types of disabilities can access and use the facilities offered by higher education. So what can the university do to change this, to recruit and retain disabled students is a question. And indeed, part of that question is thinking about who has to be involved in reforming Japanese universities to be able to accommodate students with all different types of disabilities. I'll make an argument today that we're all involved to some extent in creating a more inclusive university experience. And I'll give us some time in the second part of today's talk to reflect on that a little bit, what we can do personally to make sure that universities are more inclusive and can create a more inclusive society. And indeed, the conversation about inclusive universities is really a conversation about inclusive society. It's a conversation about how by creating a space for disabled and non-disabled people to come together in different fields, where we teach about architecture, or engineering, or policy making, or media production, whatever our fields inside the university, we're creating a space that will affect society outside and enable or empower some people with disabilities and perhaps create barriers for others. And thinking about what that process looks like, how we produce knowledge inside the university, how we disabled students in the door to talk about their experiences and help facilitate that production of knowledge about how to create an inclusive society in different sectors. It's a project that we're all involved in, and it's one that I want us to think a little bit more about today. So with that said, as Jim kindly mentioned at the outset of this presentation, we're going to be dividing today's workshop into two parts. The first part is going to be thinking a little bit about the history of disability inclusion in Japan. And I'm going to be focusing more on physical disability today, if only because there was a presentation on developmental disability a couple of weeks ago as part of the series. And I also think that physical disability can be a good starting point for some of these conversations. So we'll think about some of the barriers that have prevented physically disabled students from joining or participating fully in university spaces. And we'll also think about what the university can do to make sure that they're able to participate in other parts of society. In the second part of today's workshop, we're going to be thinking a little bit more about practical strategies for inclusion. What we can do as students, faculty, staff, affiliated members of the University of Tokyo, as what can we do in our own spaces to contribute to these conversations around inclusion and make sure that we are in fact helping more than we are hurting in terms of creating a more accessible and equitable space for disabled people. So with that said, I can't really dive right into the history without talking about myself for just a moment. Why I'm doing this work, what questions brought me in to the study of disability in Japan, and what my take on it is, because I want to be upfront and explain kind of where my perspective is coming from and why I'm presenting this history and these strategies for inclusion in the way that I am. So I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo. As you can see from the photo here, perhaps less evident by my virtual background, I am a wheelchair user. And I also use 24-hour caregiving to get around. Diving into my own disability could be a way of talking about how I've gotten into the study of disability. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. It wasn't natural that I was disabled and therefore studied disability. I had a path to get to be where I am. So I'm going to describe that very briefly for you. So I was born with a rare with a rare degenerative neuromuscular condition, basically a muscle disease that affects 6 people on the planet. And essentially, the way that it works is that over time, my body's muscles get weaker and weaker and weaker. Well, when I was 10, because my heart had gotten weaker as a muscle, I had to have a heart transplant. And that meant that I was spending a lot of time in the hospital. I was taking immunosuppressive medication to make sure that my body did not reject the transplanted heart. And that meant that I was not really able to live a similar lifestyle to my peers. You know, when the other children were outside on the playground, I was inside wondering why I couldn't go and join them. I had a lot of time and a lot of space to think. And in addition to thinking, I also had a lot of time to watch TV. And growing up in the early 2000s in the United States, what that meant is I had a lot of time to watch Japanese anime, which was starting to become popular. And what I saw in anime was very different from what I saw in American cartoons at the time. I saw philosophy, psychology, discussions of the way that the body works, cyborgs, things that reminded me of my own experience as a child with a disability who was trying to figure out how my body worked. Um, and I became interested. I really wanted to learn more about anime. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go to Japan one day and learn more. My disability brought me to Japanese studies in that way. So I did travel to Japan after some degree of muscle weakness. I had moved into a wheelchair, but I decided that I was going to study abroad. So I set out, I got in a plane, and I landed in Tokyo. But um, as soon as I got there, I started to experience a number of barriers, things that prevented me from going out and going to school as an exchange student or hanging out with my friends at karaoke booths and other entertainment spaces. And to kind of show what this looks like, I'm going to talk just about my everyday life. So to give you an idea, as a severely disabled wheelchair user, when I got to Japan, every day I would get up with help from a caregiver. And I would have to have someone help me sit up in bed because my arms and my legs didn't work well enough for me to be able to move by myself. I would then transfer into my wheelchair, which an engineer built. And I would drive it across my apartment, which an architect had put together to be barrier free, so I could navigate in my wheelchair. After getting around my apartment, I would get in my shower, which had to be modified by a medical equipment specialist. And I would follow tactile pavement, these little yellow blocks you sometimes see on the sidewalk, which was set up by a city planner to reach a train station where I would use my government issued disability pass to pay for a ticket and then have a station attendant help me get on board the train. And finally, I would enter the classroom where I would take classes, and I would have to have an academic administrator help set up my accommodations. So I would be able to have a desk at the right height, for instance, or have someone take notes for me. So my life, in a lot of respects, was like a puzzle. I relied on so many different people every day to get me from my waking up in the morning to school and home. But the problem is that sometimes that puzzle didn't fit. Sometimes the architect and the engineer didn't talk to each other. So my wheelchair might have fit my body, but I couldn't get it in the front door of a room because the door was the door was too small. So I couldn't use a lot of spaces. Sometimes if I was in a different wheelchair, it would have been fine. So all these different people I relied on weren't necessarily talking to each other, or they weren't necessarily thinking about me, an American wheelchair user, when they were building for a Japanese space. And I wasn't the only one who was left behind. Many disabled people, students and otherwise, were left out of different parts of society because these different experts or practitioners, people, were not talking to each other. If you want an example of this, let me show you. So I saw this when I got to Japan. This picture is a little bit extreme. I can't hear you, but I'm sure at least one of you just tried to laugh when I showed this. But this bridge that I have here says that it's wheelchair accessible. I can tell you as a wheelchair user, I would fall off this immediately. Not accessible, really. So this is what happens when an architect has good intentions, wants to help people, but doesn't necessarily coordinate with other groups. The engineer who builds the wheelchair or the wheelchair user themselves to ask if they can use it. So when I experienced this, I really wanted to know why or how. How does this happen? So I enrolled in a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania to study the history or, or the policy or the reasons why this would occur. I started off by looking at law and policy. I wanted to know what laws governed accessibility in Japan. What was the mandatory width for a door or the height for a desk? But what I found out pretty early on is that the law was this idealized image. It was an imagination of what things should be, and it didn't really fit what people around me were experiencing, what I was experiencing. So I combined my policy studies with anthropology and sociology, thinking about how different groups of people are affected by the law. If the door width legally is 70 centimeters, does that work for this group of disabled people or that group of disabled people? How do they respond to it? I started looking at ethnography and anthropological, sociological methods as a way of getting at disabled experience. But even then, that was also not sufficient because even if I was hearing from disabled people themselves, I wasn't necessarily hearing from non-disabled people about how they understood the problem. Did they know about the issues these disabled groups were facing? Did they know what they could do to find out? Well, To figure out how the public understood disability, I started looking at media, movies, anime, representations of disability. And what I found is that the scholarship on this topic was often taken out of context. And what I mean by that is you would find people discussing disability in 9th century Japan in the same sentence as disability in 21st century Japan, without thinking about how the concept changes, how people change, how attitudes change. So I knew that media wasn't enough either. I really needed to look into disability history to think about what context, what historical processes were shaping how disability was understood, and what could be done with that awareness to fix the problem. Okay, so that's enough framing. That's how I got to study the history of disability in Japan. And now, with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about that history so we can understand how the puzzle didn't fit for some people, how that bridge came into existence, and what the role of the diversity is in part, creating that problem and also solving it. So I'm going to start us with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Japan opens its gates formally. We start to see the adoption of uh, different types of technologies from American and European institutions, countries. We see trains, we see new medical, all of it's demonstrated itself to be modern, and then so doing to combat a notion that would show Japan as potential by an increasing presence of Americans and Europeans, imperialists in Asia. So Japan is adopting all types of new technology. It's gradually working to modernize, to industrialize, to urbanize. Well, as this is happening, we see different groups of disabled people affected in different ways. Many of them left behind, and few of them able to effectively organize and protest for better access to education, employment, entertainment, different parts of society. Why? Well, let me give you a couple examples here. So deaf people who might want to push for better access to education at this time are affected by regional differences in sign language and education. If you can't speak the same language, it's very tough to form an organization that would lobby for rights. And if it's different by region, you're not going to be able to do it at the national level that effectively. As Japan is adopting its new skyscrapers, it's building its new cities, we see people in wheelchairs and those with different types of mobility disorders being unable to navigate the new cities because of architectural barriers. They can't get on the trains to organize and have a meeting. People with infectious diseases, Hansen's disease, other tuberculosis, different diseases are often confined in hospitals or sanatoria to prevent the spread of infection, and therefore they're not able to organize that effectively. By contrast, one group really stands out, and that's blind people, and specifically blind elites, those with money and resources for education, who have an easy way to communicate with each other and mobilize. So they have Braille, which, unlike sign language, is very relatively easy to standardize. And unlike people in wheelchairs, it's easier for them to navigate things like stairs. They're able to organize in different ways. And blind people use this privilege that they have to bring together organizations, associations, to lobby for better rights and protections. They set up Braille newspapers around the country to recruit and gain knowledge from other blind people about how they can better pool their resources to effectively fight for better access to education and employment. By the end of the 1920s, Japan has its first national organization for blind people. And this organization is able to amass donations, support from around the country, which it uses to establish connections and get favors from Japanese politicians who might be able to help out. Indeed, by the 1930s, this organization of blind people is so powerful and has so much money and time, resources, that they're able to send researchers overseas and recruit support from famous activists, advocates like Helen Keller. So here I have a photo of Helen Keller with a famous blind activist, Takeo, who invited her to come to Japan in 1937. They traveled around the country and visited more than 200,000 people, talking about the needs of blind people and what the Japanese citizens and government could do to create a better system for them. So unlike other groups of disabled people, blind people had a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources, and were very organized because of the way that the industrialization and urbanization process favored them. This really mattered when Japan entered into World War II. When, especially after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which was a moment in time in 1937 when Japan saw a major escalation in the number of wartime casualties. It saw many more wounded veterans than it had in the buildup to this particular incident. This is typical, sometimes kind of characterized as Japan's real entry into World War II. When this sudden increase in disabled veterans happens, all of a sudden the Japanese government has to find a way to create welfare for its veterans. Up until this point, there wasn't really a way of supporting disabled veterans in the Japanese legal framework. So how do you build a welfare system to accommodate different groups of people, to accommodate all the new veterans? What are effective measures for them? Well, Japanese policymakers didn't really know, but because Helen Keller had recently been in Japan, and because there was this very noticeable group of blind activists and advocates, they knew where to look. So during World War II, the Japanese government partners with this National Association of blind people, and they worked together to establish a welfare system for disabled veterans. And in theory, everyone would won here. And what I mean by that is the government got a better welfare system for veterans. That meant that more people were likely to enlist in the army, more people would be willing to fight because they knew there was protection on the other end. Meanwhile, the veterans won because they got better services, and the blind consultants won because they were paid for their services. In theory, this benefited everyone, and it worked for a while until Japan lost World War II. When Japan lost World War II and the occupying forces came in, the situation started to change. So one of the first things that the occupying forces did was to take welfare away from veterans who had enjoyed it during the war. The fear was that by giving veterans welfare, we are going to allow Japan to remilitarize. People who were, quote unquote, aggressive elements were going to fight back. So Japan had a problem. There are 800,000 plus wounded veterans and no way to give them welfare in the post-war Japan. What can we do to fix this? Well, one of the things that they tried to do, they being Japanese policymakers, was to create a welfare policy that would not focus on veterans, but would be able to benefit them, and that would appeal to the occupying forces' rhetoric, which was about democracy or equality. So the first thing they did is they established a system based on poverty. They made a law called the Public Assistance Act. And this said that everyone who is poor in Japan can get welfare. Well, in post-war Japan, everyone was poor. So there wasn't enough money to go around. Then when that policy failed, the government said, well, wait a minute, what about disability? Veterans were mainly wounded in combat, and disability was a large enough category to include non-combatants. So in theory, this would work. But in practice, the occupying forces said, well, by disability, you really just mean veterans and a small other group of people. Show us someone else who's going to benefit from this policy. And we returned to blind people who had gained all that money during the war, who had been active for so long, who after the war, hey, look, we've been discriminated against. We need equality. We need democracy. They were already partnering with the occupying forces, and they had the military connections to be able to, in theory, solve the welfare problem for veterans. So blind people were the only participants, disabled participants, in the creation of Japan's first disability law in 1949. Because of their involvement and the fact that the law was about primarily veterans, the first disability law focused on people with specific conditions: visual impairment, hearing impairment, mobility impairment, missing limbs, and central nervous disorders. So there are many types of disabilities that we think about today that were not covered here. Heart defects, infectious diseases, internal injuries. Many groups of people were left behind by the first law. That would not have been a problem, except that when Japan entered into its economic miracle in the 1950s and 1960s, and the economy started to bounce back, we saw many new types of disabled people who had problems that were not covered. So if you think about it, if you have a factory, people can get injured. You have pollution. If you have cars, well, you have car accidents. If you have medical advances, well, then people are living longer, and there are illnesses tied to old age. There are so many different groups of people who become disabled or face new barriers as Japan's economy starts improving. And the legal system is not designed to support them. Now, the Japanese government knows about this. They decide to establish a number of laws that, in theory, would create some pensions or set up ways of helping these large groups of people. But just like the earlier poverty law, there are so many different types of disability to be accounted for. There's too much need and not enough way of targeting individual groups. So these policies, there's not enough money to go around, and they don't really work. This becomes really apparent at the 1964 Paralympic Games, when you have international athletes come to Japan in these very high-tech wheelchairs, sitting next to Japanese wheelchair athletes who are using wheelchairs that are of lesser quality or demonstrate, the fact that they've not been fully integrated into society. It's a very stark visual. And it's so bad that the crown prince makes a comment like, gee, welfare is really going well abroad for persons with disabilities, as if to imply that it wasn't going well in Japan and things had to be done. So after the Paralympics, the Japanese government does a survey to see just how many disabled people there are. And they find that between 1960 and 1965, the percentage of disabled people in Japan has increased by around 20%. It's growing and it's becoming a big problem. How do we take care of so many people with different disabilities, different needs, when we have limited money, limited resources? Well, the solution that the Japanese government comes up with is to build large residential institutions. You could think about almost a hospital, which might have 100 rooms for disabled people to live in, and a small number of caregivers who are able to care for them. In theory, this is great. We're able to maximize the cost-benefit ratio. But in practice, this didn't really work out. These institutions were built outside of major cities where land was cheap. They were overcrowded. They were underfunded. And the people who worked there were overworked as they tried to deal with all these different types of disabilities that they might not have known how to help people with, or might not have had the resources to effectively give care. So abuse becomes a problem. There's no oversight. There's too much work. And it's not just abuse inside of these institutions, it's outside too. So as cities are becoming increasingly inaccessible because of the development of skyscrapers, things like that, we're seeing the families of disabled people have to deal with a difficult decision. Do they leave their children at home where they can't go outside? Do they send them to institutions where they might be abused? With no good option, in the early 1970s, we see a number of uh, cases of infanticide. Parents killing their disabled children in so-called mercy killings, believing that death was a better future than what awaited them in an inaccessible and abusive society. Disabled people were not numb to this. They were upset. They were outraged. And they began to organize in response to this threat. They partnered with other groups of people who were also affected by Japan's inaccessibility. Feminists who were thinking about their children, old people who had similar needs to be able to navigate, transit systems, for instance. They joined hands and protested throughout the 1970s. Thanks to their protests, there were some improvements. Many streets began to install ramps for people in wheelchairs to be able to get up and off curbs. The first accessible Shinkansen, bullet train, was built. New types of wheelchairs were made that would help people live in their community a little bit easier. But for all of these improvements, there were also a number of problems. By the end of the 1970s, more than half of disabled people reported only going outside once a month. Why? Well, let's say that we install an accessible toilet in a skyscraper, but the skyscraper itself is not accessible. It doesn't really matter. Let's say we make the workplace accessible, but the school to get there is not. It doesn't really matter. Let's say we make education accessible, but you can't take the train to get to the school. It doesn't really matter. Everyone is trying their hardest to make inclusion, but there's no coordination. So in the end, no one wins. Things start to change in the 1980s, in part because of the UN International Year of Disabled Persons in 1981. This is a moment when Japanese activists and international activists can come together to discuss what could be done to fix this problem. We see Japanese activists taking this moment of encounter with their international counterparts as an opportunity to travel to Japan, outside of Japan, to other countries, to learn about their disability systems throughout the 1980s. And we see people from abroad, the United States, Europe, coming to Japan throughout the 1980s to share stories of what works for them. And what we find is that community-based services, things like caregiving outside of institutions, things like environmental reform, so like rebuilding train stations and rebuilding houses to be more accessible, is actually cheaper economically and more empowering than running institutions which facilitate abuse, create lawsuits, or the medical care there could be costly. You know, a little bit of community-based services, independent living services, Jinitsu Seikatsu in Japanese. Those are what seems to be the way forward here. And just as Japan is developing this community-based service system, in the 1990s, we see the collapse of the asset bubble. The Japanese economy starts doing worse. And we see the needs of a rapidly growing aging population coming more into view. So we have domestic disability advocates, international advocates, old people, feminists, all coming together in the 90s to discuss the need for a more inclusive society. In part because of their efforts, we saw a push for what is called universal design. This is, in theory, the creation of facilities and services that could be easily accessed and used by as many people as possible. In theory, this would allow all these different groups of people who had their own needs to have those needs met, to improve conditions in education, employment, entertainment venues. But in practice, there was still problems. And I'm just going to give two brief examples here to explain why universal design was the issue in the 2000s that will help bring us to the current moment. So the first example is
Sorry, Mark, you've kind of gotten a little choppy there.
In 2000, Japan passed a law that, in theory, would provide make public transit accessible to persons with disabilities by mandating installation of ramps, elevators. Oh, sorry about that. How about now? Is that better?
Yeah, I think that's better. I think probably about the time that you came to this slide, you started cutting out. So just to let you know.
Okay, sorry about that. I think my connection just reset. Are you able to hear me now? Okay.
Or sorry, yes, sorry, I was on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. So this slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry about that, everyone. So Japan passes this law that says we're going to make public transit accessible. We're going to install ramps and elevators that would help uh, not only wheelchair users and disabled people, but also old people who have similar accessibility needs. It might help parents whose kids need strollers, things like that. It would help a lot of groups of people. Well, the problem is that oftentimes these elevators and ramps were being installed retroactively in, and they were costly. You know, it costs a lot of money to install an elevator. So they would often be put out of the way in remote locations or at the end of like a train station, for instance, where it might be harder to get to, but because it's harder to get to, it's not disrupting regular flows of traffic. It's allowing people who would normally use the train station to continue using it as they had. Well, again, in theory, this you're provided the accessibility by having the elevator, but it's not usable. So it's not really a great solution. And furthermore, because that elevator was designed with different groups of people in mind, old people, disabled people, parents with children, they all have to share it. One elevator for all these different groups of people. Not to mention, people who might not need it per se, but still choose to use it. There's such a competition to use these new accessible facilities that in the end, disabled people are often left behind in the 2000s. I can tell you from personal experience, I would try and use a train and I would have to wait half an hour for a station attendant to grab a ramp so I could get on the train. That delay would not only affect me, but it would affect everyone who depended on me at my school or my work. Everyone else was affected by my absence and my delay. So it was a problem for a bunch of people. And it wasn't just transit where this universal design was causing problems as it was trying to fix them. Another example that we could talk about is the Long-Term Care Insurance Act, Kaigo Hoken, which was passed in 2000. In theory, this would allow anyone in need, disabled or old people, to get access to medical care. But in practice, that medical care was costly and there wasn't enough money to go around. Just like we saw people trying to save money by installing elevators at the far off point on train stations, we saw different cost-cutting measures in the creation of this medical system. For instance, it was decided that every day people could get 4 hours of caregiving at their homes. Well, if you only need 4 hours, that might have been fine. But if you need more than that, 24, for instance, you're left behind by this policy and you had to pay out of pocket, which was expensive. The Japanese government is aware of this. It tries to create a system to have it be equal and says in 2006, under a new law, that everyone is required to pay 10% of their medical expenses. But there's a problem here. If you are an old person with relatively little medical expenses, who has friends and family and is in relatively good health, you're able to afford that 10%. If you are a younger person without that support network, who has a more severe disability, who is less likely to be able to work, your medical expenses are higher and you're less likely to be able to pay them. So by creating this policy in theory for everyone, in reality, the Japanese government ends up excluding a lot of people and forcing some into poverty. There are protests as these universal design policies are put into effect. It's not just enough to have a facility that is easily accessible or available to old and disabled people, parents of children. It has to also be usable and effective. And this is the real lesson to learn from the 2000s. And if you want to talk about the way that this problem of the usability of services affects different parts of society, I can think of no better example than 311. So when Japan has the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in March of 2011, we see all the problems in the disability policy system come into light. Disabled people cannot get out of their houses to escape the earthquake. Disabled people get to shelters and are unable to get the medical services that they need. And even if they get those services, they're not able to race their non-disabled counterparts back into the cities to get supplies, food, water, shelter, because there's a competition for those elevators, for that transit system. And those delays become life-threatening. In fact, roughly 1/4, 25% of all deaths linked to 311 were disabled people. This is a statistic that I don't think gets talked about enough. But at the time, it was talked about to some extent. It made the news. Both domestic and international activists criticized the Japanese government for its failures to implement universal design and to create a system that actually helped many people. And that criticism is what helped give rise to the current policy framework in the early 2010s, which focused on anti-discrimination, not just accessibility, but lack of discrimination so that the accessibility could be used. So in 2013, Japan passed the law for the elimination of discrimination against persons with disabilities, the Shogai Sabetsukai Shoho, and in 2014, it ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Shogai Shoken Nijuryaku. Now we had a legal system in place that could solve, in theory, these problems of improper implementation. But that new legal system had to be enacted. It wasn't enough to just have a piece of paper saying, don't discriminate. Society had to change. And how would that happen? Well, the answer is Japan won the bid for the 2020 Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. This was an opportunity for Japan to take those new laws and put them into practice, to change education, to change employment, to change transportation. And indeed, we saw changes. So we saw hard changes. And by hard changes, what I mean is the environment. Trains no longer needed ramps to get disabled people on board. Schools installing accessible bathrooms for disabled students. Workplaces moving desks around so disabled people can more easily use them. There were environmental changes. There were also soft changes, and these could be described as educational or consciousness shifts. Not only was the ramp being removed from the train, so a disabled person could easily get on board, but there were educational initiatives to teach about disability and explain why that was necessary. To talk about how the facilities that had been shared by different groups of people needed to be used in certain ways, why some people should be prioritized over others. There was conversation around what equity and inclusion means. The conversation that we're having today, I would say, is an extension of this. And in part, as the environment changed, as the awareness around those changes spread, we saw transformations in social consciousness. The election of new disabled diet members who would be able to represent disabled people in politics. But for all these changes, the problems still remain. And there are reasons. You know, from the time of the Olympics were announced until the time that the games took place this past summer, there were many constraints that stopped these inclusion efforts. One of them is just material constraints. It's very difficult to rebuild all of society. It's very difficult to find the physical resources to do that. It's extremely difficult to find the human resources to make that transformation happen. To train station attendants in how to help disabled people with the new system. To find caregivers for disabled people to help them out of bed in the morning. You know, in part because of the aging population problem and the fact that there's a labor shortage. Currently, the supply versus demand ratio for home helpers in Japan is 1 to 13. 13 people who need care, one of them gets it. No matter how much we try and fix that deficit, there's got to be problems, right? And as you might imagine, one of the largest constraints in fixing these problems, in implementing this new anti-discrimination legislation, has been COVID. COVID stopped the construction projects. COVID made learning about disability inclusion more difficult for many people because we're no longer in the same spaces communicating as we were before the pandemic. COVID distracted public attention from inclusivity towards survival in some cases. Other topics became a matter of media discourse. And yet, even with these constraints, the games were able to shine light on the problems. It started conversations around what Japan still has to do, where it needs to improve. And those conversations were not just internal to Japan either. because of the international spectacle of the Paralympics, other countries were learning from Japan, its successes and failures. Japan was learning from other countries. What could it do better and how? And those conversations have continued. They're affecting not just disabled people, but others who use the innovations developed for them, the elevators, the ramps, old people, parents, not just in Japan, but around the world, are learning from what Japan has done, and they are contributing to what Japan will do. But this is a very involved system. And just as I've said in the last couple minutes, its education changes, employment changes, transportation changes for so many groups of people. All of them have their own diversity, their own different needs. Which way should Japan go forward? Who gets to say so? How do they get to say so? Well, we return to the university and our role here. The university is a way of guiding the production of this conversation around the future of inclusion. We all, from our own disciplinary perspectives, contribute to knowledge and the actualization of that knowledge in changing education spaces, employment spaces, in getting disabled people into the university, giving them education, letting them share their experiences, and reshape our disciplines. We play a role in getting non-disabled people to know more about disability and think about how it affects their own activities, their jobs, whatever field that might be. The university is key to the conversation around inclusion. And that's where I want us to transition into the second part of today's workshop, which will be focusing on what our role is. But before I do that, if there are any questions about the historical section here, I'd love to take those just so we have a clear understanding of how we've gotten to this point and where we're going. So I'll turn the mic back to Jim momentarily.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much. That was very awesome and enlightening historical perspective about Japan's progress and at times shortcomings towards creating an inclusive society for disabled individuals within the country. So maybe before we go to the Q&A, maybe we could all just give Mark a nice virtual Zoom style round of applause.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I guess for this Q&A, I think maybe if you have a question, it'd be great. Maybe you could use the raise hand function, and I think Mark can call who wants to ask a question, and I think we'll proceed from there. I guess typing a question in the chat is also fine. Okay, all right. Yeah, maybe since the next part, I guess that will be more interactive.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can go ahead and just.
Sure. So then why don't I transition to the next section here. Okay. So what can we do with this knowledge of the history, the successes and the failures of inclusive policymaking in Japan? What is our role as members affiliated with the university in guiding this process? That's where I want us to move to now. So towards that end, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what I've done inside of my role in the university. And then I'm going to ask some questions that I hope we can all engage with in terms of sharing information and thinking about our own roles. So to begin, I'll start by describing how I've taken my work inside the university and tried to use this historical knowledge in my teaching and my other activities to raise awareness. So as Jim kindly mentioned at the outset of today's talk in his introduction, I work as a policy consultant. I coordinate with the US, Canada, the UN. I work with the International Paralympic Committee on thinking about issues of inclusion, thinking about how do we get as many people involved in the policymaking process as possible to make sure that their opinions and their perspectives are understood and can be acted on. And one of the ways that I've done that is through something called the Accessibility Mapping Project, which I started during the course of my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And essentially what this is a crowdsourced mapping tool that is designed to show the inclusivity or exclusivity of university spaces and think about how to rebuild. So, for instance, it would show you a map like this, where you would see different campus buildings, and anyone would be able to go in a web app and describe in video, audio, pictures, text, different input methods. This building works for me, or this building does not, and this is why. This building has a wheelchair accessible bathroom. This building does not have a prayer space. This building is able to accommodate a wheelchair that is smaller, but mine is larger, so I could not use it. Users can add as much fine-grained information as they want to share their experiences, to highlight their diversity, and to help us learn about what's working and what isn't working. In theory, when I first made the app, I was thinking, okay, so if I need to find an accessible bathroom on my college campus, this will let me just click a button and I'll be able to highlight where all the different bathrooms are. That's great. That's useful. That'll help me get from point A to point B. Universities need to be to have different ways of showing inclusion, and I felt that would be a useful contribution of this project. But I learned that it was actually about than just creating a map. And let me explain why and how. So the way that this application worked is we got a bunch of people together, students, faculty, and staff, who would go around campus as a group and measure the spaces in their own terms. So here I have a photo of myself measuring a door on campus with some friends, and figuring out, was it wide enough for my wheelchair or not? Well, besides just making a map, this was also a chance for my friends who were with me to see the world from my perspective, because we were going around and talking. It was a chance for them to tell me about their perspective. My friend might have needed a gender neutral bathroom. I might not have been thinking about that beforehand. I might not have ever even thought about that as an accessibility issue. But they told me, and I learned from them as we went around together and did this mapping. It was an educational experience that changed how I thought about that space, and not just inside the university, but outside too. Because when I went home, I started thinking, huh, there's no gender neutral bathroom here. There's none at the coffee shop near my house. By using the university as the space for sharing knowledge, we began to rethink about how the spaces outside of the university worked as well. And what we ended up doing is taking our experience in doing this participatory mapping and turning it into courses. We made lectures on what inclusion means to different people who are part of our campus community and on how to solve the issues that we saw. If there was not an accessible bathroom, we'd bring in the architects, we'd bring in the engineers, we'd bring in the people who were involved in fixing that and discuss with them the perspectives that we were gaining from our knowledge collected activity. This was a teaching moment. Now, I made a fancy phone app that has all types of technical features, and it looks daunting. It is daunting. I know nothing about programming. I had someone, thankfully, had the help of someone else in putting that side together. But you don't need to have some fancy technological apparatus to do this type of work. To share your perspectives on accessibility is a conversation. It's not, doesn't have to take place via a phone app. The classroom is a space where we're going to have these conversations. The space, the lecture space where we're in right now is a time to have these conversations. So this gets us to thinking about you for a minute. What does accessibility and inclusion look like for you? You might not be disabled, but you still have to get up. You still have to go to school. You still have to ride the train. You have your own needs and desires, which may be met, may not, but there's a chance to share them and to think about what the university can be doing better to accommodate you and what your accommodations could do for other people who might not be able to raise their voices. We might not hear about the disabled person outside of our university, but you can bet they're going to benefit from what we do inside of it. So thinking about how we can share our experiences for other groups of people is really important. And I want to start us thinking about some questions that will hopefully allow us to share our experiences and learn from each other to think about the next step for creating a more inclusive society through the university. So I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask everyone is, what does it mean to create an equitable learning environment? In the course of my talk today, I've discussed how a barrier in my home might stop me from getting to the train system. If I can't get on the train, I can't get to the school. If I can get to the school, maybe I can't get into the classroom. And if I'm in the classroom, maybe the lectures are not being offered in a way that I'm able to easily learn from, because I can't sit at the front because there's no accessible desk, or uh, there are numerous barriers. So I guess one of the questions we have to ask is, how do we create inclusion inside the classroom if there are barriers everywhere outside of it and within it? What is within our control to change and what isn't? What should we put our resources towards and what shouldn't we? What have we done to accommodate disabled people and what do we not have experience in? So I guess one of the first questions that I'm gonna throw out to everyone practically to answer, if anyone would like to answer, is, what do you think the boundaries of an inclusive educational experience are? What experiences do you have in dealing with the barriers that a disabled student might face or someone with another type of diversity? Have you encountered this problem before? And if so, what have you done about it? If not, why do you think you haven't? In other words, why aren't we aware of this if it is a problem? So let me start by just opening the floor to that. Does anyone want to share their experiences of trying to create inclusion inside of universities, or what they've seen in terms of people trying to do that?
Well, I'm happy to go and give a start at it.
Sure, if you
Um,
don't mind.
yeah. So, right. Guess it would have been. I guess it would have been the summer before the pandemic started. Yeah. So I teach English classes, and I was told I'd be getting a student who was blind, and I relied very heavily on PowerPoint slides. So I didn't have much of a strategy what I should do. I think I lucked out in that case. Like the student knew what worked for them. So I was able to consult with the student what to do. But in that case, I think the student had good access to technology that if I put the PowerPoint slides, if I put any text I had into a text file, the student had a device that could, it was really cool to watch the student use it. It was like this instantaneous Braille device.
Yeah.
So, yeah, basically what I had to do, I had to go through all my material, look at, I ended up fixing a lot of things. I had a lot of things that were wordy, spelled incorrectly, which probably helped every student by making those slides more clear.
Yeah. Thank you for that. If I can just add one quick comment before we move on to the next contribution. I think there's two things I want to touch on. The first is making an inclusive space for one student can often mean creating an inclusive space for everyone else in the process. As we rethink access, we can actually create possibilities of conversation that we never even thought about before, as we're introducing new perspectives into the classroom, reimagining our own materials. So I think that is a really important point to touch on. And the second is, you mentioned this student had relatively good access to technology. They were coming from a position of relative privilege. I think it's important that you recognize that, because it's a chance to think about, well, what might have happened if they didn't have that? Because often we don't know about the students we don't see, right? We don't know about the students who are not in our classrooms because of these barriers. But if we have one who is there and who was lucky enough to have the privilege to talk, well, then it's a chance to think about all the others who are not there yet and what we can do to make sure they're able to get there. So I think that's a really valuable contribution. Thank you. And I think we have another comment here from Itasu-san.
Hi, thank you. I learned a lot from your lecture, so thank you very much. I we currently have I belong to the Global Leadership Program at the moment, and so we've had students in the past, and as well as we've got students right now who have visual impairment, and we heavily rely on the student letting us know what we can do. And I think that conversation has always been really eye-opening, actually, because the students really do know exactly, like they're very much in charge of their learning. And that's been quite inspiring, I think, for the students who are also there in the classroom as well, because they're kind of more responsible in terms of the learning that they receive. And so, yeah, so they've been fantastic. And so I just wanted to echo that it's a great learning experience for everybody, as well as in the classroom, as well as for us. So thanks.
Thank you so much for that contribution. I think it's really important that we recognize that disabled students, in part because they've had to navigate so many barriers and jump through so many hoops to get to where they are, they have this incredible knowledge base that they can share. I'll give you one practical example. Let's think about the transition to online learning when COVID happened. I can tell you firsthand, many of my disabled colleagues were the first ones that universities turned to because they'd been doing remote education from their hospital beds for years before the pandemic. So they had a knowledge base that could be actualized to actually help as soon as this crisis occurred, and everyone benefited because of it. So I think that's definitely true. There's one kind of caveat that I want to throw out here, and that's it's not always the case that the student knows exactly what they need. It's not always the case that anyone knows what they need. So let me give you an example. If I ask you, how far does someone have to walk to be disabled? Is it 5 steps, 10 steps, 20 steps? How far can you walk before you have to stop? You might not be able to easily tell me where that boundary is. You might not be able to easily tell me, what you can and can't do in response to any given problem. So it's not necessarily the case that the student will always know what they need, and it's not always the case that they'll even know what's available. So let's say, even though we have an excellent Office of Disability Services, the students may not know about its existence. They may not know about what types of accommodations they're going to ask for. They may not know how that syncs up with their previous accommodations at other institutions. There are many awareness problems and difficulties in determining exactly what we need. And this applies for non-disabled people as much as disabled people. So I think being aware that there are those contributions, while also recognizing that we might not necessarily be able to always articulate them as clearly due to our own lack of awareness, that we need to remember both sides of the equation. But I think it's a very valuable contribution. So thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
Anyone else, or shall we move on to the next kind of probing question? Well, okay, in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to the next question, if that's all right. So I'm just going to share my screen again. We kind of hinted at this in the previous question, but I think it's worth explicitly thinking about. Have you worked with disabled students or faculty? Have you done collaborations have you heard their experiences? You know, one of the problems that I've seen in my own experience in academia is we start from a retroactive understanding of accommodation. I have a disabled student come into my class. I need to provide this. I need to rebuild my existing lectures. That's time and energy, and there's a lot of potential hesitance to do so. There's a lot of complications in doing so. And the reality is there are different ways of creating accommodations. There are different ways of helping disabled students through our classes. And one way to reimagine how we teach is instead of thinking, well, how do I bring this disabled student into my lecture? It's how do I build my lecture with that student so that they're the one driving the educational experience and their contributions, like what we just spoke about a moment ago with Itatsu-san, are the focal point that they're shared. And I think there's a space for thinking about co-designing syllabi with our students. There's a space for thinking about not just hearing their own awareness about their needs, but using that as a starting point for a conversation from our own disciplines. So for instance, my sister is or was a biology major. She has the same disability that I do. And one of the things that they did in our course is thinking about, well, why is it that there wasn't another wheelchair user in the biology classroom? What parts of the lab were inaccessible to her? And how could we think about a more inclusive science? And what would that mean for science as a field? Those types of questions became central to a syllabus that she had written with her professors. And I think we all have that potential. So I guess one of my questions is, does anyone here have experience kind of working on a project with a disabled person and not sort of top down responding to accommodations request, but actually designing, co-designing? Has that been part of anyone's experience? I see Jim shaking his head no. Well, while I'm waiting to see if anyone decides to say yes, I'll just say one follow-up, which is, if not, then how can we do that? Should we do that? I would say we should. And I would say that we can have a conversation around how we might invite students to the table to help participate in this type of course design, because that will ultimately leverage their strengths. That will help empower them and get their perspectives out there to other people who might not otherwise encounter them. Thanks so much for sharing that, Cecilia. I appreciate that. So yeah, I mean, I think this is one opportunity for curricular innovation and for our development as faculty is to think about how we can partner with different diverse individuals. You know, I'm focusing on disability because that's the topic of today's talk, but we can imagine a co-designed course with people of different genders, different races, from different countries, how we can leverage all of their different experiences to redesign our syllabi and make them not only more inclusive, but more useful in terms of their contributions. And to that, what Itatsu-san said earlier. So I guess that's just one thought I want to leave in everyone's mind for right now, is that idea of co-production. And I'm looking at the clock at around 15 minutes, so I'm going to move on to the next question. And this is perhaps even more central than the idea of co-production, or perhaps something that we should think about before inviting students to the table, is we really have to, well, before, during, and after, I'll say actually. Does your research, teaching, service, activities as a faculty member in a particular discipline intersect with disability or diversity? In some cases, this might be explicit. I'm an architect. I build accessible spaces. I'm an educator. I teach about inclusion. And in other cases, it's more subtle. I work in biology. My work might not necessarily be about accommodating disabled people, but it still affects them. It produces a science that changes how we build technology, and that technology then trickles down to make things more or less accessible to them. So thinking about the ways that our research intersects with different people is important, and I want to talk about that. But before I do, I just noticed a comment in the chat that I'd like to read. If I may voice this, David, if you don't mind. As a visiting faculty member at Todai on a Fulbright, I teach students in North American studies about institutionalized discrimination in the United States, the idea that the greatest problems faced by people of color in the US are not the result of current prejudice, so much as the result of institutionalized inequities in the past. Now I'm thinking about disability in similar terms. I wonder if the greatest problems are from historical inequities more than current prejudices or fears, at least in the US context that I know best. In other words, as important as consciousness raising and fear reduction are, addressing personal attitudes on the individual level alone will not fix things. I agree wholeheartedly. I'm a historian, and there's a reason I'm a historian, because I think that these problems stem from the past, and any amount of attitudinal change in the present will produce a more inclusive future. And as someone born and raised in the US, I can speak to that context. I'll say there's actually a really interesting conversation here around historical inequity between Japan and the US. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it'll do value to our current conversation. In the US, accommodations for students with disabilities were provided under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990. The problem in the US is that for that law to be useful, it essentially comes down to a lawsuit. Let me give you an example. There's a store that has a staircase out front. To get those stairs removed, I have to sue them. That's time and money and energy. They don't have a lot of incentive to change otherwise. And by the time that I'm done suing them, they may be out of business. That lawsuit doesn't do it. So if it's not a life or death problem, nothing is changing. Japan's legal system may be younger. It may be less developed in some ways than the US system in terms of case law, examples. But even then, because Japan has so much social pressure, because of this history that I've mentioned, because there is the aging population problem, because Japan has ratified the UN Convention, because Japan has all of these domestic and international reasons to become accessible, and there's money in accessibility because it does accommodate these different groups. The reality is it doesn't come to a lawsuit in most cases. Fixing those stairs could be done by saying, hey, think about your mother. She's getting older, isn't she? So the reality is, even though the US legal system is older, the Japanese system benefits from the social pressure in a way the US system does not have as much, and therefore is developing at a faster rate. And it's partially because of that acceleration that the university has a chance to contribute. Because it's developing so fast, there needs to be someone to steer the ship and make sure that we're developing in a way that helps people. And again, this is where I think the university comes in and has the potential to contribute in Japan in ways that might not be as possible in the United States. So I think that's an interesting dynamic for us to talk about. But I appreciate your comment about institutionalized issues, and I certainly agree with that. We're not going to create an inclusive future unless we start with the past. So I have one kind of final question I want to raise. I'll ditch the PowerPoint. It's cumbersome. Excuse me for just one moment. Okay, so the last question I want to raise to everyone here. We're all working from our own disciplines, from our own perspectives, on our own issues. They might explicitly relate to disability, they might not. But one thing that I think we all share is our research affects different groups of people. And in some ways, it's used by different groups of people. Maybe we're a historian and our work could inform architects. Maybe we're an economist and our work informs policymakers. But ultimately, those individuals, while they may be our students at one point, go off into the world and exist in the practical space outside the academy. That doesn't mean that we can't invite them back in to talk about what they're doing to reshape accessibility, disability, inclusion issues. And that doesn't mean that we can't engage them in dialogue about what they're doing well or what they can improve on from our perspectives as researchers and faculty. So one of the questions that I think we ultimately have to ask ourselves is, the university is a bridge for the academic and practical world. What can we do to help facilitate those conversations through the classroom? And is that something that could be of use? And who needs to be involved? I think that's just one final topic I want to throw out there in the air for people is hopefully if you come away from this conversation with anything, it's that you have the potential to redesign syllabi, to reimagine your partners in the classroom, whether they're disabled students, whether they're expert practitioners in different fields. You have the potential to add to conversations that are going on inside and outside of the university. And you have the potential to steer our way forward at the where we currently are at the tail end of this 150-year-long historical process that I've described. We're at a pivotal turning point where Japan can become a leader on the global stage for reasons that I just mentioned in response to David, where we're actually seeing Japan eclipse places with longer histories like the US in terms of disability policy. So I think just having us all reflect on our role in making sure that the future is desirable for different groups of people, that it's something that actually helps them. this conversation that we're having today will not solve any issue immediately. We will not come up with some grand strategy to all of a sudden include every disabled student. We're not going to get around the fact that only 1% of disabled students are enrolled in the university, as I mentioned at the start of this talk. But hopefully, this will be a jumping off point for future conversations for us to think about, in the long term, how to reimagine our teaching, reimagine our research, reimagine our service in the benefit or towards the benefit of people with diverse disabilities. And hopefully we'll start to do partnerships to make a more inclusive society. So with that, I'm looking at the clock at 6:55. I want to make sure that I spend some time to turn back to our organizers and just to thank you personally. I appreciate the opportunity to come speak today, and hopefully this talk was of use.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, we just give a nice a virtual applause again for Mark. So yeah, this has been, I think, a very enlightening and eye-opening discussion, I think, for a lot of us. I think there's a lot of things we can walk away with and think about. So yeah, from GFD, I'd like to thank you for giving this presentation for us. As we close our, yes, okay, so Cecilia has posted a link for call for participants for Inclusive Academia Project in the chat. And you know, we hold these workshops quite often, and we really value your feedback, right? What do you like, what you dislike, what would you like to see in the future? So a link to a feedback form has been posted into the chat window, and we would greatly appreciate if you would take some time to fill that out. Okay. Do you have anything else you'd like to mention, Cecilia? Okay, all right. So I guess on that note, again, I'd like to thank you, Mark, for giving us this talk. We look forward to continuing these discussions on diversity and inclusion, and hope maybe we can have you back sometime. So that'd be great. And so everyone else, thanks for attending tonight. We would appreciate it. We hope to see you at future GFD events. So have a nice evening. Thank you.